Hello, my name is Whitley Miles, and for this research paper, I researched under what circumstances women in the Old Testament stepped into egalitarian-like roles. I argued in this paper that women stepped out of their traditional complementarian-like roles and into egalitarian roles when the men in the picture could not or would not do what was needed. I first researched what society during this time would have looked like. I read articles and books like A Biblical Investigation of Matriarchal Structures and Women's Lives in Biblical Times to discover whether or not the society could be labeled as patriarchal, complementarian, or egalitarian. It was from this research that I discovered that although we normally think of the Old Testament as a patriarchal society, and these times as patriarchal society, that it was not patriarchal, and women had very specific roles that were important to the functionality of their society, and those roles were different from man's roles, making the society complementarian. And this still didn't explain the instances in the Bible where women step into these really strong leadership positions that make a difference within their household and sometimes even their nation and for their people. And it's in these scenarios that I found that it was always when a man could not or chose not to do what was needed that women stepped into these roles that would normally be preserved by a man. And so I recalled stories like Esther and Mordecai. I started off with going through stories where a man could not do what was needed. And so Mordecai had no way into the palace except through Esther. And so it was up to Esther to do what was needed to save the Jewish people, even though it was traditionally and originally Mordecai. He was very zealous and very passionate and heartbroken over what was about to happen to the Jewish people. So Esther stepped up despite what the traditional roles for a woman in her place were. We saw at the beginning of the story where the woman was banished, she was exiled, and that's why Esther is even here in the first place. And so she stepped out of that traditional role and into one that made a difference for all of the Jewish people. The second woman I looked at was Rahab in Joshua 2. There's not even a man mentioned in Rahab's story. It's just her and these Israelite spies, and she makes a deal for the sake of her family. She becomes the protector of her family. There isn't a man mentioned for her until several chapters later when the Israelite people are about to take over Jericho, and Joshua tells the spies to go and get her mother and her sisters and her brothers and her father out of the house. And so from the get-go, Rahab is the one to protect and step up and come into this leadership position for her family. The next woman I looked at was Ruth, with Ruth and Naomi. Now, Ruth and Naomi's husbands were dead. There was no one to take care of them. They were widows, and traditionally this would have been really, really bad for them. But Ruth refused to leave Naomi, and that saved her family. She became the provider until she could find someone that could provide better in Boaz. After I looked at these three stories, I looked at stories where a man chose not to do what was needed. And so the inspiration for this paper in the first place was in Judges 4 with Deborah, Barak, and Yael. And we see Deborah as this leader. And for the Israelites, she's the only female judge mentioned in Judges. And she calls on Barak and says, "You're up. We're going to save the Israelite people from their oppressors." And he says, "I won't go without you." He's refusing to go without her. And she warns him and says, "Because of this, the victory will be put into the hands of a woman." And in enters Yael. Now, she was just a woman in her tent during the day, doing her thing. And she was the one who ended up saving the Israelite people from their oppressors, when traditionally it would have been Barak originally. It was supposed to be Barak, and he chose not to, and in entered our women. Finally, I wanted to bring some balance to prove that this was not a man-bashing paper, and I decided to speak about a notoriously evil woman in 1 Kings chapter 21, Jezebel. King Ahab so desperately wanted Naboth's vineyard, and he refused to sell it to him. And so King Ahab came home and refused to eat, and Jezebel said, "Do you want to know what? I'll take care of it." And stepped into this very powerful role. She sent letters with the king's seal and had Naboth killed. And although this caused a lot of death and destruction for her, King Ahab wanted something that he would not get for himself, and so Jezebel did it. And so there are so many even more stories than the ones I had room and time to discuss in this paper. Sarah and Tamar are two more women that did some pretty incredible things to not only get what they needed, but what they wanted. And in the end, you can definitely see that there were times that women stepped into roles that were normally meant for men in the Old Testament, but due to the circumstances, the men were not able to perform these roles. And so women stepped out of traditional complementarian-like society roles and into roles that made a difference. Thank you.